Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Windows 10 Cloud Managed Desktop webinar. My name is Jay Parak. I'm Practice Director and Partner at Netrix, the company that's hosting this webinar. With me is Phil Schwan. Phil is a technical architect here at Netrix, and he's going to go through the entire webinar with a presentation as well as some demos. Phil, can you give a little introduction by yourself, please?
Sure. As Jay said, my name is Phil Schwan. I've been working in IT, specifically in desktop engineering, for just shy of 20 years now, working primarily around OSD, SCCM, and most recently Intune and Azure.
Thank you, Phil. So just a quick overview of Netrix. We are a global organization based out of the Chicagoland area, 300 plus employees with over 200 technical resources, with presence all over the US as well as Bulgaria and Pune, India. We cover 10 different pillars here at Netrix. We won't go through all of them here for this call, but all things around cloud, Azure, data center, as well as all the Microsoft technologies from Office 365 to enterprise mobility to Windows 10. And unified communication, as well as a lot of non-Microsoft technologies that we cover as well. The presentation today is done by the Enterprise Computing and Mobility Practice. That's where Phil, myself, and several members on this call are part of. We cover all things around a data center and outside of the data center, the end user compute side, operating system migrations, desktops management, patching, profile management, and so forth. This team here has been doing desktop management type of work and consulting for over almost 20 years, from Windows 95 XP to now Windows 10. And recently, as of last week, we are the Microsoft US top Windows 10 deployment partner nationwide. We were awarded that last week at the Microsoft Partner Conference in Washington, D.C. This is not a regional award, but a national award that's been recognized by Microsoft as one of the go-to partners for all things Windows 10. And with that, I will let Phil go ahead and take over the webinar, and we'll go through the agenda and continue on. During the session, we have several members from the team, Rich Lilly, Steve Moten, and Chris Clark on the call as well. So if you have any questions, you could feel free to IM in the IM window, and we'll monitor that and answer questions as we go through. Bill?
Excellent. Thanks, Jay. So just a quick view of the agenda that we're going to go through. We're going to take a quick look at traditional management versus more modern management. We're also going to do a quick sidebar and take a look at Config Manager versus Intune and how some of that will play in, since a lot of people are using Config Manager today in their environment. We'll take a look at how we can address specific issues around information protection in a more modern management scenario. We'll look at some of the security and stability settings for the systems, and then we'll kind of go and tie it all together and see what it looks like end to end. As we go through, I'll probably pop out and do some quick demos. Some of it's just going to be kind of a look and feel, and others will kind of show, what this actually looks like in practice. So modern management, why are we looking for a cloud managed desktop? Cloud managed desktop is a term that Microsoft had used for a while as they started to roll out Windows 10 and started to give the integration with Intune and with mobile device management. But really they were looking at it at a larger scale and a larger paradigm around what they call modern management versus the more traditional management paradigm that we're used to. So what does modern management look like? Well, it's centered around some key features that we wanted to use. One is just simplification of the device management lifecycle. So the less that we have to do hands-on management or meticulous management of devices, the better. Devices have become so ubiquitous, and we're so far removed from the days where it was just one user, one device, sitting in a desk. Users have multiple devices across multiple platforms, and they need to be able to use and work on those devices. And so we need to be able to manage those devices as IT without having it being so cumbersome that it's cost prohibitive. Because of that, while we want to simplify that management, we also want to make sure that the platform itself is secure, and that wherever possible we can keep it up to date. So as users, use their apps and more importantly their data across multiple devices, we want to make sure that data is secure, because that's the lifeblood of our organization, and we want to ensure that those devices are kept up to date and don't fall prey to vulnerabilities that develop over time in any given device platform. From a scaling standpoint, we want to be able to leverage the cloud services that are available to us. So Microsoft has invested heavily in their cloud-based services, and a lot of those services have been around for a really long time, even before the term cloud became more widely used. So we want to be able to scale up our management of these devices by leveraging those cloud services versus having to spend the time and the resources to manage an on-prem infrastructure. Of course, cybersecurity is a major concern. We're reading almost daily about major vulnerabilities that have been exploited, and so we want to make sure that we minimize that as much as possible. Nobody wants to be the next one to be in the news, so we want to make sure that we address those issues. And then centrally to that is the user is ultimately the one that has the device in their possession, especially as we look more towards mobility. Those devices tend to travel with the users rather than being physically secure within, brick and mortar facilities. So as much as possible, we want to allow the user to perform some of these activities and to be responsible for some of these activities. And we can force them through different policies to comply with those, but ultimately we can put the burden and the privilege of IT in their hands. So as we look across the whole stack of Microsoft services, we can see different areas where we can look to modernize or to simplify those pieces. So when it comes to deployment, starting to look at the ability to not image a device, not have to heavily manage the image that's on the physical device itself, but rather just utilize what's already there. Traditionally, as IT, that hasn't been a very feasible thing. If a user goes out and buys a device, whether it's from a big box store or even gets a device shipped to them from the manufacturer, a lot of times that's going to have a lot of trialware, a lot of bloatware, and a lot of other utilities on there that we as IT may not necessarily want. But the core underlying OS itself is there. So what can we do to transform that operating system to something that's more usable and secure for IT while still giving the end user plenty of flexibility? From a management standpoint, taking that just enough approach rather than having a heavy thumb or heavy hand on the device and controlling every single aspect of that device. Can we just ensure that there's enough management to both enable the user to do what they need to do and also ensure that the integrity and security of the data and the applications that are on it? From a productivity standpoint, being able to provide the latest and greatest features for their applications, and particularly when it comes to the Office suite. So the Office suite is so central and vital to most organizations. We want to make sure not only that the users have it, but that the platform that they're using is kept stable, kept secure, and kept up to date. So as new features and new devices get introduced out there, making sure that they're easily able to have those latest features without us as IT having to go through the burden of packaging up and deploying a whole new suite of applications to the user just to get them those new features. From a security standpoint, starting to leverage Active Directory in Azure. So, many of us have Active Directory, traditional Active Directory, as our on-premise identity source, and we can still continue to use that as our primary source of authentication or identity. But being able to synchronize that into our Azure presence and then leverage that as something that's available globally. Something that can be authenticated against easily regardless of where the user is, internally or externally, without having to expose our domain controllers to the outside world. From a data and settings standpoint, ensuring that the user experience is consistent across all of the device platforms, not only between different platforms, but even on the same device platform as they may roam from one machine to the next, ensuring that not only the applications, but the data and the user experience follow with them as they go, and keep it resilient so that if for whatever reason a machine is damaged catastrophically, or it's lost or stolen, or for whatever reason is no longer usable, that the data and the experience doesn't die with that machine, but rather transitions from that machine to others. And then from a support standpoint, being able to leverage data analytics and cloud services to be more proactive in discovering issues and getting those fixed before it becomes a help desk call, before the user has to take time out of their day to contact the help desk, ask them for help, and wait for that help to arrive, whether it's instant over the phone or they have to be contacted back. Could be something as simple as self-service password reset. So many services out there today offer the ability, if you forget your password, to go through a process to retrieve that password or to reset that password. And so we want the same capability to be in the hands of our end users so that they don't have to call in because they forgot to reset their Active Directory password because it expired at the end of 60 days. So kind of boiling this down to some of the more traditional or some of the more key functionality areas, looking at the provisioning of a machine. So the traditional method has always been OS deployment or imaging. So we have a managed image that we wipe whatever comes on the machine itself or whatever happens to be there at the time, and we lay down our own customized image onto that device. And that image includes our apps and our settings and all these user experience things that we want to build into it. Versus a modern approach, which is basically taking what is already there and simply repurposing it or reconfiguring it to match the needs of the organization. And being able to do so in a manner with something like the newly announced service Autopilot, where we can take device information, import it into our essentially managed cloud service, apply a configuration profile to it, and then when the user logs onto that machine for the first time and goes through that out-of-box experience, they get a customized experience to our organization. It's branded with our logo. We can customize privacy options and other aspects of the out-of-box experience just based on the fact that it recognizes that it's a corporate-owned device. And then on top of that, we can use what are called provisioning packages, which we'll take a look at in a minute, which do that sort of in-place reconfiguration of the operating system. So unlike some past versions of Windows, Windows 10 is Windows 10 is Windows 10. Everything is there in the operating system. It's simply features are lit up or disabled based on the SKU that's applied to that system at the time. So all we need to do to light up certain features at an enterprise level, for example, is simply apply an enterprise level SKU to that device, and those features are automatically lit up. So we can literally take a Windows 10 home device, repurpose it to Windows 10 Enterprise, and light up things like BitLocker to enforce encryption on the device. So again, we'll take a look at some of the options we have around that shortly. From an identity standpoint, we already talked about the difference between leveraging your traditional on-premise Active Directory versus using your cloud-based Azure Active Directory as your source of identity and authentication. From a device membership standpoint, we're looking at transitioning from your traditional either a workgroup PC that doesn't have a domain membership or a device that creates a separate computer account in your traditional Active Directory, and transitioning to Azure Active Directory domain join, where a device record is created and associated against an identity within that directory service, which then provides us additional levels of authentication and trust and policy management that we can apply based on that user-to-device relationship. From a software update standpoint, so we talked about keeping devices up to date and stable. Traditional software update management for an enterprise using WSUS or Config Manager with WSUS provides very granular selection of patches. I want to install this patch, but not this patch. One of the key tenets around management of software updates in an enterprise is we don't want to let the users go out to Microsoft to get updates because they might get everything. We want to pick and choose what they get. And we want to target that, and we want to schedule that appropriately. So if we want to defer it for 6 months, we can defer it for 6 months. The more modern management approach to that, in conjunction with the updated servicing model for Windows 10, is that we use what's called Windows Update for Business, which is just a series of settings that manipulate the local policy to say, Microsoft's going to release things on a certain cadence. And we can gear when our users install those things as a date and time relative to that cadence. But Microsoft is still the one that's giving us that cadence, and we're still looking to Microsoft to see what updates are available. So we can simply leverage these policies, and we can stage those updates, so we don't necessarily want to, the latest build of Windows 10 to go out to all of our cloud managed systems, on day one. So we can identify a certain number of systems that we want to target initially, and then progressively stage it out from there in update wings or waves. And if we happen to know there's a particular issue that comes up with those initial pilot users, we can set deferrals and say, actually, we're going to defer the install of this update for a period of time until we can get whatever applications or whatever testing is out of the way to require that. From an application standpoint, we can look at transitioning from the traditional Win32 applications to our universal Windows apps. So the bulk of the applications now that are installed as part of the core Windows 10 OS are universal Windows applications. They're no longer Windows 32 apps. So we can start to manage those applications and provide additional applications using Microsoft Store for Business. So we can bulk purchase those applications and assign them to users. We can do license reclamation. But we can still maintain that ability to deploy legacy 32-bit apps to the machine. Right now, it's right out of the box. We can do simple MSI-based installations, but we will also be providing the ability to do Win32, executable-based apps, even PowerShell scripts, and other more traditional methods of installing applications or configuring apps on systems. From a management agent standpoint and a policy standpoint, and these two kind of go hand in hand. On the traditional side, we have config manager client. So the config manager client is essentially just doing manipulation of local group policies to do the configuration of the device. So group policy is still central to the management platform for traditional OSs, and it's still something that's available in Windows 10. But increasingly, there's a transition being made to the mobile device management platform with OMA-DM or OMA-URI being able to manipulate policies through a built-in agent that does a little more streamlined management and manages them much in the same way that traditional mobile devices are managed. So right now, it's not a traditional management is expiring at the end of the month, and you have to rush into this new scenario. Both of these are existing and continuing to be developed in parallel. The question becomes, when does it make sense to do one versus the other? So as we get a machine online and associate an identity and establish the security model around the system, that's when we move into that paradigm of continuous configuration and updating of that system as we manage it on an ongoing basis. So there are some really simple criteria that we can look at that will help us determine which way we want to go with the management scenario. And the easiest one right now is based on the use case for the machine itself. Is this a machine that's going to be static on a user's desk, inside our brick and mortar facility, or is this a machine that is going to be, at an end user's desk at home, or going to be traveling with them on the road? Is it going to be primarily internet connected versus local network connected? So if it's going to be relatively static, it's going to stay, local, then go ahead and domain join it and manage it in the traditional fashion. Use your config manager, use group policy, use your traditional management tools to continue to manage that device. If it is going to be on the go, though, then we need to just ask, is it already something that we're managed? Is that device already being managed? We already have it joined to the domain and under that management paradigm. If so, there's no need to change it. There's nothing forcing you to do so. But if it's not already domain joined, then that's where we consider, is this a device that we as a company own, or is this a device that the user owns? If it's a company-owned device, then we'll go down the modern management path where we actually join it to Azure Active Directory, enroll it in Intune, and manage it as a mobile device. If it's a end user's device and they want to retain the ability to log in as their own local account and perform different functions, then we'll simply do a workplace join of that account, and we'll look at some of the differences between those two shortly. But either of those fall under that modern management paradigm. So when it comes to that first piece of it, that provisioning part of it, where we manage, what's initially on that device, we talked about provisioning, and provisioning is both a process and it's actually a product, if you will. There's a product called the Windows Configuration Designer and a companion app, the Windows Imaging Configuration Designer, that creates what are called provisioning packages. And those provisioning packages do just what I described earlier. They take the OS that's there, that's already on the device, They do a little bit of transformation with it that may or may not involve the end user actually doing anything. And then they bring that device up to a state that's ready for productive use within that environment. So looking through some of the different options that we have there, for those company-owned devices, as I said, we can directly join that to Azure Active Directory, and we can do that either during the out-of-box experience, having the user log themselves in and do the Azure AD domain join, or we can do it after the fact if it's a machine that's already been started up for whatever reason, or we simply want to change the management method for that machine. We can have them go in to add, add a work account, and they can perform an Azure AD domain join from there. In that particular scenario, it will actually log them out and create a new profile on the device with that Azure AD account and allow them to log into that and use the services that are associated with it going forward. Versus your BYOD scenario where we simply add that account and associate that account to the device, but they continue to log in as their normal local user account and user profile. In either case, though, we can have that automatically enroll the device in Intune. So where mobile device management was traditionally something you had to download an application and go through an enrollment process, we can now actually automatically do that as soon as they associate that or register that device with Azure Active Directory. And from that point, then they fall under our management paradigm in which we can provide things like changing that Windows SKU, so upgrading them to Windows 10 Enterprise, doing various settings application, pushing down applications as needed. On the flip side, we can do, as I said, using a provisioning package and make some of those settings changes directly through that method. So we can, again, change the Windows SKU, we can install apps, we can perform a number of administrative functions on that device, and then as part of that, even have it go through the process, again, of automatically enrolling, registering an Azure AD and enrolling the device in Intune. These provisioning packages can be sent manually, or they can be actually added to images. There are PowerShell commandlets that are available where you can apply those provisioning packages on the fly. You can literally email these provisioning packages to a user and tell them to just execute it. They're executable files from the standpoint of Windows 10, and depending on what settings are involved, if it's just a settings-based provisioning package and it doesn't include applications or things like that, you're talking maybe 5 to 10K, so it's very, very lightweight. And what it essentially is doing is just performing, if you're familiar with traditional OS deployment, it's just performing the same types of functions that an unattend.xml file would perform during Windows setup, only it's doing it at runtime instead of forcing Windows setup to run again. And then, as I mentioned earlier, around the autopilot program, you can pre-populate some of the information so that you could, for example, reset the machine to remove the bloatware from the machine, force the machine to run the UBI again, and then as part of that, they would see, because their device is already registered with autopilot, they would see a customized login screen for joining Azure Active Directory and a customized UBI experience to boot. So again, one quick thing, looping back on the provisioning packages, and we'll take a look again at those in a second. But essentially, you have just a very nice, either a very simple wizard that you can do some basic configuration options, or you can dive in with an advanced editor and get really granular at the options that you want to configure as part of that provisioning package. So I won't labor the point here, except to say that they're continuing to invest in this technology and to streamline it to make it much more usable from an IT perspective. So to see just real quick what the user experience looks like for doing this type of cloud management or modern management, when the user gets to the device, either or when they get the device from the manufacturer and boot it up for the first time, or when we run a provisioning package on the device to kind of reset it, remove the bloatware, and reinitialize the UBI. The first thing they're going to get is your standard things about choosing the region of the machine, choosing a keyboard layout, things like that. Those things all come on at power on. At that point, it looks for an active network connection. So you have the ability to make sure it's internet connected at that point, and if it is, it will automatically sense that. And it will reach out and look not only to Microsoft to see if there are any setup related updates or stability updates that need to be applied specifically during UBI, But it will also look out and see, is this device registered with autopilot? Is based on this hardware profile, is it already considered a managed device from the standpoint that it's owned by an organization that wants to apply a profile to it? If that's the case, what you would actually see here is a branded, customized sign-in screen. Otherwise, it's just going to present you, if you're online, with the ability to log in with a cloud-based account. So if this is their personal machine, they could just log in with their Hotmail account or their Live account. If they wanted to do a traditional domain join, there's a link down there that could actually do that instead. But in this particular case, we're looking for them to be able to sign in with their Azure account and register this account against Azure AD and do an Azure AD domain join. So once they provide those credentials and get signed on, that's when it joins and it enrolls and policy begins to take effect. So immediate security policies like setup for Windows Hello automatically kick in and say, hey, you need to set a PIN code for Windows Hello, and forces them to go through that process. And then from that point on, that's when your policies and your applications and everything else that you deployed to that device starts to take effect. So we'll switch gears here real quickly and just do a quick view first of the configuration designer. So it's a fairly streamlined interface, again, for creating these provisioning packages with a few built-in wizards for going through them. So if I wanted to do just a very basic configuration of a machine, I can walk through this wizard, input the information that I want to do. And one setting in particular that's relevant to this situation is this remove pre-installed software option. So what this is doing is this is essentially performing a system reset on the device, and it removes any applications that aren't installed as part of the core Windows installation. One of the advantages here, though, is that it does retain the drivers that were installed. So the scenario in which you're drop shipping a machine to a user, or even they're getting one from a big box store, and you want to remove all of that bloatware or that try and buy trialware, you can use this option and it will perform that system reset. It will get rid of all of that, but it will keep all of those manufacturer installed drivers. So the system is still very usable when it gets to the end of this process, and as opposed to stripping everything out and them having to manually reinstall them. Again, many options here around being able to set up a network ahead of time, network connection, adding applications, adding certificates. If you have VPN connectivity that requires certificate-based authentication, you can add certificates here. You can add trusted root certs and so forth. I'm not going to labor the settings here, because one of the ones I wanted to jump back to is one I created with the advanced provisioning wizard that actually helps us with the scenario that I talked about earlier. So in this particular case, you can see there are a number of settings locations that are available here, very similar again to your unattend.xml configuration. Particularly as you start to dive down into the policies, you can see there's all sorts of things that can be configured at a device level for with these provisioning packages. But three key ones that I'm going to implement in this case are from the computer account side. We're going to go ahead and set it to use a customized computer name. So we're going to prepend it with a certain prefix, and then we're just going to grab the serial number that the machine reports back. I could also use just a random character. So if I just want to say 5 random characters at the end of it, I could do that as well. We're also going to set this option to clean without retaining user data. So this is the checkbox that we saw on the previous wizard of removing all the pre-installed software. And then we're also going to disable the hide UBI. So this ensures that once it restarts, it's going to go ahead and kick off the UBI wizard again. So if I save and export that provisioning package file, let me pull up a system here real quick. So I have a Windows 10 system here that's just it's a plain Windows system. There are no Azure accounts added to it. It's just logging in with a local account. Oops, not what I wanted. And it's just got a random name on here, whatever it gave it during the setup. But we can see it's not Azure AD or traditional domain join. So I sent this provisioning package to the machine. I could have sent it via email or however we wanted to do it. This has those three options, and as you can see, it's only 6K. It's very, very lightweight. It is executable, so I can go ahead and double click it, and it's going to tell me exactly what this is going to do to the machine, and basically ask, are you sure you want to do this, because this is what what it could do. You want to make sure you trust whoever sent this to you. In this case, I will say yes. I'll go ahead and add it, and we should see here in just a second it's going to restart the machine, and it's going to kick off that system restore. This process can take a little while, so be advised, you could be looking at easily a half-hour time elapse as it does that system reset in the background. So you want to account for that as you use this as a method for implementation. And one other quick thing we'll look at is around the autopilot. So if we go into our store for business, and I'll log in with administrative credentials that are recognized from my organization. And what we'll see is a special area under our organization specifically for devices. So if I go to manage my store for business and I go to devices, this is where I have the autopilot options. So in this particular case, I have another virtual machine that I generated the information for and imported it into there. There's a very simple PowerShell script that Michael Niehaus provided that can be used that dumps the information into a CSV file for import. And this is what it looks like. So it's just a device serial number, a product ID, and a hardware hash generated based on the hardware. The same type of information can be generated by your OEMs and provided to you. So if you bulk purchase 20 machines and you want that information, you can pull that all in via CSV file and import it. And then I have profiles specifically for that. So I import that information, and then I have a profile that allows me to enable and disable certain features during the UBI process. So in this case, they're out of the box. There are ones that are guaranteed, which is it's going to automatically initiate that setup for work or school. It's going to give a branded sign-in experience. It's going to skip things like Cortana and so forth. I also have the option to skip privacy settings or to disable creating a local admin account on the device. And so I simply create one or more autopilot policies, and then I apply those policies to the machines that I have in here. So a real quick word on some of the differences between device registration and device join. So we looked a little bit at the two different scenarios of a BYOD device versus a corporate-owned device, and doing a workplace join versus an Azure AD domain join. In both cases, the device is registered against the user's account in Azure. The difference is in what the login experience is for them and some of the additional features that are lit up with those two scenarios. So the traditional device registration is simply going in and adding a work account to your device. So it's a very simple process. In fact, I'll pull it up here on this device. But it's available for all users in the setting unless it's disabled by policy. Come on. There we go. So if I go into the accounts area and access work or school, this is where I have the ability to add those accounts. So I can simply go to connect. It's going to prompt me for login information. By default, if I just log in this way, so in this case, I'm providing a cloud-only account. Oh, it's already connected, that's right. But basically, it would prompt me and give me actually two different options as to whether I wanted to just add the account, which would be a traditional workplace join, or I actually have a separate option I can click on to do an Azure AD domain join. And as I said, the primary difference there is in creating a completely separate profile that the user logs in with. And once you do that, then you get into some of the other features that we talk about, and I'll go through them in a little bit here. Things like being able to store the BitLocker recovery key against that object, or being able to use enterprise state roaming for that seamless experience roaming between machines. But generally speaking, it provides the same thing in terms of single sign-on to cloud-based applications, software as a service applications, as well as some other functionality around general Azure usability cases. So I'm not going to go through all of the different options that are in this slide. This slide deck will be made available at a later time for reference. But you can see as we look through all of those different areas of management, some of the differences that you get between Azure AD domain join, just your workplace join, and a traditionally domain join device that happens to have a workplace join done after the fact. So my laptop in this particular case, when I received this laptop from my company, it was already joined to my on-prem AD. So I went ahead through a workplace join and added my work account to it. So I'm still logging in with a local AD user account profile, but I get some of the benefits around being able to single sign on to applications and establish device trust relationships and things like that. So a quick word on group policy versus the new OMA URI management method. Group policy is going to check in by default every 90 minutes with a random offset of 30 minutes. Whereas the MDM policies, when you initially enroll a device, it's going to check in for new policy every 3 minutes. And then after that time's out, or after it processes policy, it checks in about every 8 hours after that. And again, it's checking in with your Intune/Azure AD service, not with a local Active Directory. To force a policy update on a traditional domain join device, you simply run the GP update utility. Whereas in MDM, you can go into that settings where you had the user account joined, and you can actually force a policy refresh from there. So if I go in again under my account, go to info, I have this sync button here. I can go ahead and tell it to sync policy, and it'll reach out to the management service and synchronize my mobile policies. From a logging standpoint, in the event logging, it's under, for group policy, it's under Microsoft Windows Group Policy Operational. MDM still logs an event logging the same as group policy, so there is a place in the event logs you can go in and see any event logging associated with that and do any troubleshooting that you need to do. If you want to find out what effective policies are on a device, you can use GP results, versus there's actually a PowerShell script you can use to generate a similar type report for MDM. And then I alluded to it earlier, but an additional option you have is around enterprise state roaming. So that's basically taking some of your user profile options and being able to synchronize them in the cloud service against that identity and roam them from machine to machine. So very obvious user things like desktop background, if you keep your taskbar up at the top or off to the side, things like that. Some of your browser history, any of your stored credentials for Windows can be done, and so on and so forth, including Edge browser settings. Those can all be roamed from machine to machine, and Microsoft provides some really good documentation on the doc site as to all of the settings that are subject to enterprise state roaming. So before we go any further, I'm actually going to loop back real quick and initiate an Azure AD domain join on a test device I have here. And this is actually the virtual machine that was associated with the autopilot profile in the Microsoft Store for Business. So I'm just going to give a quick look at what that looks like. So we have a traditional out-of-box experience where it's checking as far as keyboard layout and language and so forth. And then it's going to detect automatically that we're online. And it's going to go out and it's going to check. And one of the things that we'll see is the fact that it's already registered in autopilot. So what we should see coming up next is a login screen that actually has, in this case, our customized Netrix login logo available to us. So we'll give that just a second. So there we go. So as opposed to the sign in to Microsoft, we actually see now it's asking us to sign in with Netrix. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. In this case, I'm using my cloud-based account, but I could just as easily use my regular account, pschwann@netrixllc.com. Just for policy purposes, I have some test policies that I didn't want to apply to my account. So we'll use this cloud-only test account, and it's going to ask me to enter my password, of course. And then because we have multi-factor authentication enabled for our tenant, it's actually going to ask for identity verification. So I'm going to get a pop-up on my phone here in a second from the Authenticator app, which I will approve, and it will proceed with the process. So now at this point, it should see that I have a Windows Hello for Business policy applied, so it's going to prompt me here shortly to set a PIN code for the device. I didn't disable the privacy settings in the autopilot, so I still get prompted for those. But it's going to prompt me partway through the process here as it creates that profile. So again, it's actually creating a user profile on the account specifically for that Azure Active Directory account, much the same way that if I were doing a traditional Active Directory domain join, it would create a profile based on my traditional Active Directory account. This is just doing the same thing but with an Azure-based account. So very shortly here we should get prompted to set that PIN code. And I mainly want to wait for this so that we get through this process and let the other policies continue in the background. At this point, I'll take a real quick breath and just see if anybody has any questions and wants to type them in the chat window. Please feel free to do so. Okay, and there we see our Windows Hello prompt, so I'll go ahead and I'll set up this PIN. And I can actually look in here and say, okay, I only have to do 4-digit PIN, so I'll go ahead and do that. And it says I'm all set, and so there we go. We have our login. And so one of the things that we're going to see here is we should see policy come down fairly quickly. That's going to tell us some of the additional requirements, one of which is that the machine has to be BitLocker encrypted. So in this case, this virtual machine does have a virtual TPM, so I can do the BitLocker encryption. But we'll circle back on that. We'll let some of the policies come down, and then we'll explore that a little later point. So let's do okay, so we do have a question about support for radius networks. I'm not sure where that is on the roadmap at this time. I'd have to defer. So yeah, Rich, if you want to chime in on that one. So we'll take a quick sidebar here just to look at some of the options for Config Manager. So Config Manager does actually have some additional options to leverage Azure-based and cloud-based management capabilities, aside from your more traditional Intune hybrid scenario where you're integrating an Intune subscription with Config Manager. So the real challenge here is around internet-based systems. In traditional SCCM, when you had a system that roamed from the local network outside, when they needed to make connections back to the site, they weren't able to do so. They're outside our firewall. They're not able to make that connection back to the local network to connect to their management point or their distribution point or their software update point. So one of the main solutions traditionally around that has been internet-based client management. So we're going to issue some certificates and give that machine a certificate to make them a trusted source. But then we need to place machines in our DMZ. So a distribution point, a management point, even a software update point need to be put in a DMZ. And that means we need to manage not only ports, opening ports from the DMZ into our internal systems, but also having to open ports to the outside to let them in. So there's a lot of management. It can be done in a secure manner, but it's a lot of overhead and a lot of management that we need to handle just to provide that sort of functionality. So there's an advantage in that there's no dependency on cloud services, and there's not really any cost associated other than having to maintain all the additional hardware or virtual machines in the DMZ. But the disadvantage is that you're requiring additional infrastructure in that DMZ. There's a lot of overhead, again, and operational cost for that infrastructure. And you still do have to expose, at least to some extent, that infrastructure to the internet. So the idea behind the more recent solutions is to simplify that to not require additional infrastructure for roaming systems out to the internet and not having to expose internally that infrastructure to the internet. We want something that's easily configurable, essentially in that config manager console, keeping it in that single pane of glass. And we want to make sure that a lot of the key functionality and core functionality of SCCM is still in place. And so that's why they introduced a new feature called the Cloud Management Gateway. So what the Cloud Management Gateway involves is spinning up an A2 virtual machine in Azure as a service, and then establishing a relationship between that and a connection point that exists on the inside. And the CMG connection point is just a role, a config manager role that can be installed on a system. And it communicates simply through outbound ports. So you're not having to open up for the client itself to come back in through the firewall to connect to the local infrastructure. But that connection point operates as a proxy of sorts between that and the other roles, config manager roles within the organization. So when a machine roams out to the internet, it knows to connect directly to that Cloud Management Gateway. And then, virtually speaking, has that connection back to the internal management point, software update point, etc. To provide additional content, we can then spin up a cloud distribution point, which is a role that's been around for a little bit now in Config Manager. And we can provide applications, we can provide packages, and we can provide third-party updates. One of the keys with the Cloud Management Gateway is if I do a software update deployment for just Microsoft-based patches, I don't have to manage that patch content. I don't have to distribute those deployment packages out to the cloud distribution point. It'll simply default back to Microsoft Update to get the actual content. Now, to be very clear, you're still controlling which patches get deployed to the device, but when it comes to the content portion, it's reaching out to Microsoft's cloud service to pull the content down for those updates. There are still some caveats around this. One of the ones right now being that device still has to start out on the local network and then roam out to the internet in order to use the Cloud Management Gateway. But one of the future states that they're looking at is the ability to onboard and bootstrap those clients directly from the internet. So the machine comes online, they're able to enroll directly from the internet without having to be on the local network to start. So in that particular case, it's going to do the Azure AD domain join like we just looked at. It's going to auto-enroll in Intune, and then Intune is actually going to deliver down some trusted certificates, and one of the key things is it can actually bootstrap the SCCM client to the machine. Now this is still a future state thing, it's still in development, but it was presented at the Midwest Management Summit in April as a coming feature, in May, as a coming feature that they're working on because they want to address this scenario. So typically, the mobile device management versus SCCM client have been mutually exclusive. You can have one or the other, you cannot have both. But what they're working towards here is the ability to use the Intune client or the MDM agent to install the SCCM client and then allow that client to register. And so once it's on board there, it's able to then use, it registers, it's able to use the Cloud Management Gateway, get back to the management point, get policy, retrieve retrieve content, and so forth. One of the additional things that they're talking about as a possible future state is the ability to seamlessly transition between the two. So as the machine roams onto the local network, it leverages the SCCM client to do management functions and deliver things. And then as it roams out to the internet, it switches over and automatically uses the Intune MDM client to do management and delivery and so forth. There's still a lot of moving parts that need to be addressed in that scenario, but that's a kind of a taste at one of the future states that Microsoft is working towards. Suffice it to say, SCCM is not going away anytime soon. SCCM still has a lot of scenarios in which it's much more adept at managing devices. It's still the only management platform that's really going to address things for servers. So there's no fear here that this modern management is going to completely displace SCCM anytime soon. But it's offering a much more agile and lightweight approach to doing this type of device management. So switching gears here real quickly to look at some of the policy options. We talked about information protection as a key one. So some of the options that are available for us to manage in this modern management scenario with Intune are things like BitLocker drive encryption. So we can manage those BitLocker settings from within the MDM channel versus having to use traditional group policy methods to initiate it. So not only can we enforce encryption and say you must have this device encrypted and leave it at that, but we can now start to specify exactly what type of encryption algorithms we want to use, how keys are stored, whether or not we use PIN codes at startup, and so forth. We can leverage the TPM and really maintain that core security paradigm around drive encryption. So as you can see through some of the options here, we can have them prompt and say, you need to start encryption. We can give them the option to save that recovery key not only to a file or actually print it out, which heaven forbid they actually have to print it out, but it's an option. But we can actually save it against our domain account in Azure Active Directory so that they can retrieve it at a later point without having to call the service desk to retrieve it out of Active Directory or MVAM. And then, beyond that, just simply leverage the in-the-box functionality around managing BitLocker. In terms of key retrieval, as I said, it becomes a self-service item. So if for whatever reason the machine goes into recovery mode and they need that key, they can actually log into the Azure App Portal, go to their profile, pull up their devices, and for their devices that are registered, they can actually see the BitLocker keys that are available for that device. So they're able to retrieve it, the key comes up, and they can actually do the drive recovery themselves. So again, it's that ability to eliminate having to rely on traditional IT to do these things and make the user self-reliant and self-sufficient when it comes to a lot of these core IT functions. So again, we talked earlier about being able to reset their own password, being able to do their own drive recovery is another big one. If we can save those help desk calls, all the better, especially when users could be anywhere out on the road. As long as they have an internet connection and a machine with a browser or even their phone with a browser that they can log into, they can get their recovery key and be on their merry way. Another key functionality we have is what's called Windows Information Protection. So if you're familiar with the mobile device management scenarios with Intune, they provide what's called mobile application management or MAM policies. What those are, they're application-based policies that govern how information that's associated with a corporate identity, it can be transferred between managed and non-managed applications. So an easy example is if I have my corporate email account open and somebody from within the organization accidentally sends me, executivesalaries.xlsx, can I open that Excel spreadsheet, copy the CEO's salary and pension information, whatnot, and paste it into Facebook? Traditionally, yes, that's exactly what I could do. If I have access to my email on a device, then I can do whatever I want with that data. It's outside the management paradigm. But with mobile application management policies, and in this case, Windows Information Protection policies, I can say, no, that information that's associated with that corporate identity can't be transmitted outside of that managed application. So I can copy it from a Word document under my identity and paste it into an email under my identity, but I can't paste it outside of that identity. It maintains the integrity of that data and ensures that data doesn't get leaked. So it's meant specifically to address that, in particular, that BYOD type scenario where users want to have access to their corporate email in Outlook on their local home PC. How do we govern that? How do we ensure that data is kept secure? From a Windows Information Protection policy standpoint, that data is actually encrypted using BitLocker in the background on the fly within the user's profile. So when if we need to pull back access to that, If the user's identity is disabled or because they left the organization or because of a security issue, the user doesn't still have access to that data on the local drive. They can't go in and pull that data up. Malicious software can't retrieve that data from the temp files and so forth. It's encrypted and it's secure. So we maintain that data integrity going forward. And one additional piece around that information protection paradigm is the conditional access. So being able to provide gated access to Microsoft services based on whether the device is healthy and whether the device complies with policy. So traditionally, a machine goes out and they attempt to access, it could be SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, any sort of software as a service application that we manage in Azure, or of course their Outlook Online, or Exchange Online, or Outlook email. So when they go to authenticate, because it's based on identity, they go to authenticate against that service, the service comes back and says, prove to me that you are a healthy device. Prove to me that you're trusted enough for me to provide you access to it. In that case, the device goes out and it connects to a cloud service for device health to ensure that it meets certain minimum health requirements. And then it also looks at client policies and ensures that it meets compliance policies set in Intune. So, in mobile device management scenarios, it's usually is the device jailbroken or rooted. Does the device have a PIN code set? Things like that. But the device integrity service is a relatively new service, but it's based off of the old network access protection implementation that Microsoft used to have. And it basically, again, just says, do you meet a certain minimum patch level? Do you meet all of the requirements that we have for you to be considered a healthy device? If it does, it basically generates that request. The service comes back and says, yep, you're approved. We consider you healthy. And so that's passed on to the service, and that service then grants access. So again, traditional Intune MDM for mobile devices, you already know about this in terms of compliance policies. This is just using that at a Windows 10 or Windows OS level, using that type of cloud service in addition to your traditional compliance policies. So from a security and stability standpoint, Windows 10, one of the major new pieces of that implementation was the servicing model. So instead of releasing a new operating system every 3 to 5 years and having to go through the major hassle and the major expense of going through a full OS refresh process, they moved to the servicing model, which simply releases a new operating system version, if you will, roughly every 6 to 8 months. And that's their method of introducing new security enhancements, new stability enhancements, and new features out into the environment. And then on a monthly basis, they continue to do your traditional patching with stability updates, or what they call quality updates. But these are done as in a cumulative method and an all-in-one method versus the onesie-twosie patches that we used to have in traditional patching. So rather than 10 to 12 patches in any given month for an OS, you just have this one cumulative update for the month for that OS, and it contains all of the security and non-security related patches for that OS. What we see up on the screen here is just kind of an overview of how the process goes for determining those releases, and the fact that it's actually a development cycle that progressively gets larger as it goes. So it starts with just internal engineering builds, and then progressively stages out to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of users, and so on, until it gets out into the general public. And then the differentiation as well between the current branch, which is when it initially releases, versus the current branch for business, which basically is about 4 months after a current branch release, they state it as enterprise ready. They've had some additional time out in the quote unquote real world to validate that things are going well, to get telemetry data back, and to implement fixes in the process, so that once it gets to enterprise level, everything is considered secure. So one of the big differentiators here, though, is that heavy-handed granular control for the more modern method, where you're using WSUS or SCCM, you're hosting the content, you're having full control, granular control over which patches get deployed, what the timing is, and how all that works, versus a more lightweight control with Windows Update for Business, which just says, Microsoft's going to host the content, and that all the delivery timing, while we still have control over it, is all relative to Microsoft's timing. And so that's where the options come in for the cloud-based management, where we can use Windows Update for Business, and we can say, for a certain number of machines or for users, we're going to apply, we're going to tell them they're either going to be current branch systems, we're going to let them get it, in that first wave of release, or a current branch for business system. We want this to sit for a while and to make sure that we do our own testing for our field staff before the rest of them get it. We can determine whether or not additional Microsoft product updates are included in that, or if it's just the feature release itself and the stability or quality updates themselves. We can determine whether or not we want to include driver updates in that are published by Microsoft. And then we can have some controls around when that's going to happen. So at the end of the day, generally speaking, users are still using their machines during normal business hours. Those business hours might extend into the evening some, but we might want to say, in the evening, we're fine with users being able to, to have their machine automatically updated overnight. And then, as I mentioned before, we have that ability, should we discover a problem, we can actually implement a deferral period or even pause those updates. So for different rings, we may have a current branch ring that defers updates for 1 week. And those are the initial users that get those updates. And then we might have a second ring that's still current branch but defers it for a month. And so at the end of the first month after a current branch release, then those users get that current branch build and so forth. So we can control when the updates are released, but we're still allowing Microsoft to host the content, and we're still leveraging everything relative to when Microsoft does their release. Additionally, we can manage Windows Defender, so we can manage all of the features and functionality around the built-in Defender antivirus and anti-malware engine that's already there within the operating system. It bears noting that Windows Defender is going to be enabled by default unless you install a third-party solution. If you install a third-party solution, typically Windows Defender is going to be disabled then and defer to whatever that third-party solution is. But strictly speaking, because we're looking at an easy and a light management approach to this, why not take advantage of the built-in functionality that's already there and then be able to manage that from our side. So we have plenty of policy options that we can use to determine how it's going to interact with the underlying operating system. If we want to manage certain exclusions, if we want to control how often quick scans run, how often full scans run, and so forth. And then additionally, we can layer on more and more functionality depending on our licensing as we tie in things like Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. So continuing to leverage more and more of those cloud-based services to be much more proactive about preventing threats and about identifying them once a breach occurs, so that we can have some level of post-breach strategy there to take advantage of what's already built in. And continuing with the security and stability, looking at Windows Hello for Business. So looking to leverage those more modern authentication methods using biometrics and face recognition to be able to log on to the system as a trusted device. So we already saw that ability to set a policy that kicks in right from the start that forces them to set that PIN. So as we look to kind of tie this all together, kind of circling back, the modern management paradigm is more about leveraging those lighter management scenarios. So using cloud-based services that are aware of the device even before the device is booted up, or reconfiguring the device in place rather than doing that traditional wipe and load. Taking the operating system that fundamentally is exactly the same as a managed image would be, and simply reconfiguring it on the fly to make it usable for our needs. From an identity and authentication standpoint, ensuring that we're authenticating against an Azure-based service, a cloud-based service, so that while these users are out, primarily on the go and internet-based, they always have that authentication method and all the things that entails. So all of these other services that tie into Azure AD for authentication, that becomes the entry point for using multi-factor authentication and ensuring that anytime users are accessing these services, they have to provide an additional level of security to ensure that they are who they say they are. from a membership standpoint, registering that device in Azure Active Directory so that we can begin to use things like device-based authentication or device-based trust to ensure that no matter where that device is, we know where it is and can, if need be, remove access or remove data from that device. Managing software updates using the built-in functionality and the release cadence that Microsoft has provided. Still being able to use rings to stage out those updates, but relying on Microsoft to do the content hosting for us and to do the logistics for us. And we simply, provide a light management approach to it rather than being granular and heavy-handed when it comes to those updates. Continuing to maintain those universal Windows applications while still being able to deploy traditional applications where needed, and then managing it via a more modern management channel. So yes, group policy has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of more options available at the moment than the MDM channel does. But in the vast majority of the cases, those options aren't really relevant in a lightly managed on-the-go mobile user scenario. So Microsoft is essentially building the device management platform from the ground up on the mobile device management side. Group policy is still there, still going to be around for a long time, still very usable, but now we have a streamlined and more modern management approach that we can take to it. So just to kind of as a method of looking at it, again, visualizing it, we take a machine that perhaps is direct shipped to the user, and they're unboxing it for the first time, or it's a machine that they've already unboxed and logged into, but we want to provision it and repurpose it and do that Azure AD domain join. So we initiate that Azure AD domain join, and it's going to automatically enroll us into Intune. And from that point, the first thing it's going to do is a compliance check, that health check, and say, are you trusted? Yes, you're a trusted device, and now we're going to start to let you have access to corporate resources. We're going to bring down policies. We're going to bring down certificates for the device, apply security settings, deliver applications, Office click to run, and so forth, and make it available to that device. When it comes to updates, those updates can come directly from the Windows Update service. And as I showed before, we can even tie this in if we wanted to. We can bootstrap that config manager client and have it automatically register through a cloud management gateway to their on-prem SCCM environment. So circling back real quick to our device that we did our Azure AD domain join, so we can see we've already started to deliver some applications. If we look, we can see that the Office click to run applications have come down as well. We can see that we've gotten a notification that we need to encrypt our device with BitLocker. So we'll go ahead and say that's fine, we can do that. And so it's going to check, make sure that we have an active TPM. If it doesn't, it will actually notify the user, hey, you don't have an active TPM, give them the option to activate it if it's not activated. It'll prompt us, where do we want to store that recovery key? Very easy, let's just restore it, or store it against our Azure account so that we have it available to us. And then we can go about the encryption process and let it do its thing. Any additional policies that we have around the device will continue to come down as we continue to manage that device. And we look and see that our work account that we had signed in with is here and available. We can go in, pull up information about the account, go ahead and initiate a policy sync if we want. We can go ahead and say, manage my account. Open that in Ed. Oops. Got a little click happy there. Let's come up. It's taking its time. Okay, so we can go and we can see information about our account. We can see devices that have already been registered against that account. In this case, this device is the device I'm on, this 3TD, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see that that device is already there and registered, and it's already got the BitLocker keys associated with the device. If we have things set like self-service password reset, we can go through those options there. If we have multi-factor authentication set up, we can go through those options there. So you can see how it ties in with all of the different services available to us once we begin using Azure as our primary identity and management, and Azure as our management authority, Intune as our management authority. So at that point, I'll open it up. We have about 15 minutes left. If there are any additional questions, we take a look. I can pull up the So it looks like we have a question about update rings. So will Intune Windows updates also include the drivers from Windows Update? The answer is yes. So if we go in and we look at our software updates in the update rings, we can choose on a ring per ring basis whether or not we want to include those updates. So we go into our settings and we can see whether or not Windows drivers will be included. So we can block and exclude those, or we can allow those to install as part of the Windows updates. So again, the options here are limited at this time being. They're considered, or they're intended to be very basic, but as they continue to leverage this more modern management paradigm, they continue to add functionality in here. So BitLocker is a good example. Up until very recently, you could basically just, it was kind of a binary thing in terms of enforcing or not enforcing BitLocker encryption, whereas now they've introduced that ability through endpoint protection profile policies to manage everything from the operating system drive versus removable drive, encryption algorithms, et cetera, et cetera. So because it's a cloud-based service, it makes it very agile in terms of things being updated very quickly. So as new functionality comes out, it's available very, very quickly. Certain functionality gets enabled as a preview, and so it may be available earlier to some than others, but generally speaking, when it shows up very quickly, and you don't have to worry about having to go through the process of upgrading a back-end infrastructure on-prem to get those features and functions. They're just there. So again, you can see in this case, we have the ability to use those update rings, but the actual monitoring or reporting around that is still something that's in preview that hasn't been lit up yet. But things like that are always being added to the portal. Okay. WHQL driver only. Not sure I understand the question, Paul. Right. These are going to be drivers that come down from Microsoft. They're going to be signed drivers. So
this is Jay. I did unmute the attendees. So instead of IMing, if you have a question, you may speak up as well. Okay, anybody else have any other questions around one thing? An additional thing I did want to mention around the Cloud Management Gateway option for SCCM. So there are a few caveats to that. One of which is if you're doing SCUP or any of the other options that publish third-party updates into SCCM, you still have to host that content, which means you need to copy it out to your cloud distribution point. So you have storage costs associated with that, and you have bandwidth usage costs associated with that. So that's why a lot of times, anytime we can defer to a Microsoft-based cloud service versus one that we're hosting ourselves, from an IT cost perspective, it's always better to do so, because we don't have to pay for managing, again, the costs of hosting the content and the downloads of that content. Any other questions around the cloud management scenario? So really, this does address, for me personally, one of the key pain points that I'd always had over the years with
executive users or high-level users that would purchase PCs at home and want to be able to use those PCs to access corporate content, whether it's just, hey, it's my home PC and I just want to have my email on it, or I got this really great deal on this PC and I want to use this as my thing, can you image this and give me all the corporate apps? And, as an IT professional, that was a huge pain point because it required a lot of manual processes and a lot of basically just working outside of our normal processes and exceptions. And nobody likes to handle exceptions, especially when you're dealing with a lot of automation. So this addresses some of those key pain points around being able to have a user use essentially whatever device they want, and us as IT being able to ensure a minimum level of security and peace of mind so that they can use these devices without having to bring them in to the help desk or to a depot, or really having them on our corporate network ever. Increasingly we're dealing with a lot of clients who have field personnel who are never online or who never come back to the corporate office. So rather than having to bring a machine in to the corporate office, image it up for them, and then mail it back out to them, or even worse, after that, having to rely on the user to VPN in onto our network just to get updates. And of course we know, our users always will VPN in for 4 hours at a time and just leave it sitting there so that our patches and apps come down, right? So rather than having to rely on the end user to enable us as IT to perform these functions, we're actually enabling the end user to be their own IT and to ensure that these things get done regardless of whether or not they're connecting back to our local on-prem network.
Hey, Phil, real quick
Yep.
question. I put it in chat, but it might be easier just to talk about it. So on the Apple side of things, there's that process called DEP, which is to do some of the management with Apple.
Correct.
So it sounds like a lot of this Intune is doing a lot of the similar stuff. Is there any requirement of proof of ownership to prove that you own the device, or the executive owns the device, or have that chain of custody kind of thing?
Somewhat. So when you look at the autopilot program, that it's functionally is very, very similar to DEP. In particular, rather than IMEI information, you're pulling in these hardware hashes and things like that, very similar, and registering those centrally. So that right from the get-go is identifying that as a corporate-owned device, because obviously IT has to have that information ahead of time for it to be registered against autopilot. After that, basically, when you're looking at a BYOD scenario, there really isn't a method that I know of at the moment to ensure that, because the paradigm is around securing the data against the identity. So it's basically when you're bringing your own device from an IT perspective. We don't really have a method of establishing, show me your purchase receipt, that sort of thing, specifically for that scenario. So I can't say that there's really a method to address that particular scenario, but in general terms, autopilot functionally works the same as DEP for the corporate-owned devices. I hope that answers sufficient.
Yeah, do you find that organizations that have relied on having the OEMs image the device and stage and everything before delivery will see cost savings by leveraging autopilot over their traditional process they've done in the past?
Yes, and there's actually it's a win-win between the OEMs and the organizations, because a lot of OEMs are starting to provide, for lack of better terms, an autopilot-ready image that's preloaded. That's basically just a stripped-down Windows 10 only image, because they know that the intent is just to get it on there. There's no point in putting all the bloatware on there because it's going to be taken off anyway. So I'm sure there's a minimal cost or at least a separate SKU involved with that from the OEM side when those images or when those machines are purchased. And part of that process, of course, then would be the OEM providing, the CSV file with all the hardware hash information for intake into autopilot. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a cost savings for organizations that are leveraging, Dell CFI or any of those other OEM factory imaging processes, because really the whole provisioning paradigm is all we care about is that Windows 10 is on there. We don't care what else is on there because we can easily blow it away without having to put a managed image on it. So it really does kind of alleviate that requirement for putting the managed image on it at the factory.
Does that managed image from the factory have any bearing on software assurance licensing that customers might have?
It can, and I'll admit my ignorance on the licensing side because licensing isn't really a strong suit of mine, but it could have bearing. Part of it though is again, because you have the ability to do SKU updates, it doesn't necessarily matter what license is on or associated when the machine is deployed. If we have a license available, so a Mac key or some other SKU that we can use, we can simply apply it at enrollment and change it in place. Beyond that, I'd have to defer to my colleagues on the licensing question.
Got it. So one follow-up on that, though, how is KMS service leveraged with Intune in the cloud?
It's not. So that is one caveat around that is I don't know of a method for leveraging KMS when you have machines that are, by their nature are not, on the same subnet or network as multiple other machines under that same license. So that is one scenario where that doesn't really apply well. So I'm not sure what the direction is on handling that or addressing that, other than just using a Mac. But yeah, that is one caveat.
Is there any chance that you could put a secondary KMS in the cloud and have that talk to your primary KMS that might be on-prem?
Not sure. Good question. That'd be a good scenario to try to play out. So that's another takeaway that I'll use here is how to address those scenarios.
Yeah, the only reason I ask is Mac for us with Chicago Public Schools is we just can't use Mac keys. We have so many
right.
thousands of clients, so it would be cumbersome.
Yeah, right. and currently the way KMS works is it's based on DNS and mostly around domain joined machines, right? So in theory, if they're domain joined machines, you have connectivity in the cloud, you have KMS in the cloud. As long as you could connect to it through VPN or some other way, then that's possible. But I'm not sure of non-domain joined machines how KMS would play into that.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great scenario though, and a great question for us to take back to Microsoft. So,
got it. Thank you.
Yep. Got a couple minutes left. Any other questions around the cloud managed desktop scenario? All right. So again, the video will be made available and slide deck will be made available. Appreciate everybody joining. Jay, I don't know if you have any final thoughts you want to offer.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining. The recording will be available on YouTube hopefully within the next couple of days. So I will follow up with an email to each one of you with the link to the YouTube video. So if you want to review it again and share it with your colleagues, you have that, along with some information about Netrix and how we could enable you to help you get to a cloud-managed desktop or any other initiatives you may have. If you got any questions, Phil's information is right there at the last slide deck, and then we'll also include all the information in the follow-up email. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I appreciate the time today. Have a great rest of the week and weekend. Thank you so much. Thank you, Phil, and the team.
Yep, thanks, everybody.